Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Sally Bedell Smith, author of George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved a Monarchy. The book is the definitive biography of the late Queen Elizabeth II's mother and father, based for the first time on special access to their letters and diaries in the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle that was granted by the Queen. The book will be the topic of our discussion today. A little about Sally before we start. She's a New York Times bestselling author of 8 biographies, including Diana, In Search of Herself, Grace and Power, and Elizabeth the Queen. Elizabeth the Queen won the 2012 Goodreads Choice Award for Best Book in History and Biography. Sally has also worked as a cultural news reporter for Time and the New York Times, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and an on-air contributor at CNN. Sally, welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Roman. It's delightful to be here.
Awesome. Well, to get started, who was George VI and what was he like?
King George VI was the grandfather of the current king, Charles III, and the father of Queen Elizabeth II. And he was the second son of George V and Queen Mary, born in 1895, always overshadowed by his older brother, Prince Edward. I'll use some nicknames here because that's how they were sort of known in the family. George VI was actually born as Prince Albert, and they called him Bertie. And for whatever reason, Prince Edward was known in the family as David, so I might go back and forth and use those names as well as their given names. But Bertie, as a child, was very shy and reserved, and between his 7th and 8th birthdays, he developed a pretty crippling stutter. Now, most people know of him through the movie The King's Speech, where it was an Oscar, many Oscars actually, where people learned of him and his determined effort to overcome his stutter when he became king. And so that's the sort of prevailing view of him. And as a child, he was very reticent and very embarrassed about having this stutter. His father, who was a very tough character, used to just yell at him and say, "Get it out." And as a result, he tended to withdraw from the family and remain mute, really, when they were having family banter. And so the sort of general impression of him when he was growing up was that he was not very bright. But there was a wonderful observation from one of his mother's best friends, and she said that he is far more intelligent than people would credit him with, and he has much more character than anybody realizes. But he was, throughout his early life, overshadowed by David, Prince Edward, who was charming and magnetic, and equally, he was spoiled and flawed in many ways that became apparent over the years. But Bertie was not born to be king. He never expected to be king. His older brother was going to be king. And so as a consequence, he was in the second position, what we now call the spare.
And then, so how about Elizabeth? Who was she and what was she like?
Elizabeth was from a very prestigious aristocratic family, the Strathmores. They went back many centuries. She was the second youngest of 9 children, born in 1900. And her parents, Lord and Lady Strathmore, were a little different from a lot of aristocratic families in that they were very warm and sort of enveloping. And they lavished love and attention on little Elizabeth, who was an exuberant and pretty and much beloved daughter. But the thing that that really struck me when I was doing the research on her family is how much tragedy they faced when she was growing up. By the time she was 15 years old, she had lost two of her six brothers, one from a brain tumor and the other in a battle during World War I. And three of her other brothers all suffered shell shock, what we call PTSD. So it was a very privileged family, of course, but it was also a family that endured a lot of tragedy. And during the First World War, they turned over Glamis Castle, which was their massive home in Scotland, and made it a convalescent home. And Elizabeth was in charge of, she wasn't a nurse, but she comforted. They had over 1,000 wounded men, both physically and psychologically. And she was faced with this every day. And, she really learned not only to express compassion, but also to be strong. So it was a very formative experience that in many ways, I think, helped her when she became queen, particularly during the Second World War.
Did you get a sense for how all that tragedy shaped her?
Well, I mean, I do think it gave her, it deepened her empathy, which may have already been there. And it also, when you read the descriptions of some of the wounds that those men had, they were pretty horrific. And I think it did give her the ability to kind of look past very disturbing things that came up in her life and try. I mean, she was accused sometimes of what they call ostriching, which is if something bad was coming along, she would just sort of avert her eyes. And that may have been a result of having seen so much at such an early age.
So then, how and when does their love story begin?
Their love story is really what made me fall in love with doing this book, because it was so kind of sweet and dramatic, and it had all kinds of twists and turns that you sort of wouldn't expect. They met in the summer of 1920 at a military ball in London. He was 5 years older than she, and they danced, and he fell in love with her immediately. Now, what he didn't know is that she was madly in love with a man who worked for him, his equerry, a very handsome Scot named James Stewart. But he was determined to get her to marry him. Bertie was. And so he pursued her for 30 months. And along the way, he proposed to her twice, once in February of 1921, and then again in March of 1922. And both times she turned him down. But he persisted and proposed one more time in January of 1923. And then what was extraordinary, and what I found in the diary that was in the Royal Archives, was that it took her 12 days to make up her mind. And I counted the number of hours she devoted to discussing this proposal. I mean, all of her friends, everybody in her family knew that he'd asked her to marry him. And it just went on. And finally, late at night, on January 14th, 1923, she said yes. And it was fascinating to see how it was almost as if a switch flipped, and they were, all they'd corresponded a lot. They had seen each other a lot, but everything was very restrained. And suddenly their letters were overflowing with love and terms of endearment. And it was just a sort of remarkable thing to see unfold. And with that, I mean, she was reassuring him and saying, I really, really do love you, Bertie. You must know that, and I'm going to love you more and more. And that turned out to be true. It was a great love match, and she was exceedingly devoted to him for the rest of his life.
That's beautiful. Can you actually talk a little bit more about that? How were they as a match?
Well, they were sort of perfect as a match. He had a sort of shy, steadfast personality, and she was more exuberant. And she was definitely, I mean, he was strong, but she was strong in ways that helped him. I mean, one thing she was very dedicated to was helping him with his speech therapist, Lionel Loeb, which we saw in the movie The King's Speech. Unlike a lot of movies about the royal family, that one was pretty accurate. I mean, they changed a few things around, but it really captured the dynamic. And they were in ways that I hadn't been aware of. They were a real partnership. He shared an enormous amount with her. I mean, she later said, he told me everything, and that included all the secrets in World War II. So it was a sort of ideal partnership.
So how did they become king and queen?
How did they become king and queen? Well, they never dreamed that they would become king and queen. The favored one, the older son, Prince Edward, became king in January 1936 when his father, King George V, died. That was that. But it turned out to be a tumultuous reign that only lasted 326 days. And during that time, he tied the royal family up in knots. They were distressed for his entire reign because he was absolutely obsessed with Wallace Simpson, the twice divorced American, that he was desperate to marry, even though both the Church of England and the British government said that reigning king could not marry a woman who was twice divorced. But he insisted on marrying her, and he wanted to make her his queen. But in the face of that opposition, he had to abdicate, which he did on December 11th, 1936. And all the drama of the abdication was going on under the radar. I mean, there were American newspapers that caught wind of it, but for the most part, the British public was in the dark. I mean, everybody in the family knew about it. But it was interesting in reading the diaries of Queen Mary, which were, to be honest, very boring. They were just sort of, here's the weather, here's who came to lunch today. And then suddenly, 2 days, 3 days before the abdication, she said, there's this little mini explosion of emotion where she said, and David is going to marry this woman. And so, it's just sort of out of the blue, but she was so distressed that she actually expressed her distress in her diary, which was very unusual. But so that's how they came to the throne, and or he came to the throne, and it was interesting because people wondered if he could handle it because of his stutter. And it was very moving, actually, when he went into the accession council the day after he became king. And he said what he needed to say, but he was very deliberate and pausing a lot and, being very careful. And so there was, on some level, I think there was worry that he could handle it. But there was a letter that she wrote. I mean, they were thrown by it. They were rattled by it, the sudden new responsibilities that they had. And she wrote actually to several friends. And she said, but the curious thing is that we're not afraid. And he, in fact, was better prepared to be king than most people realized, and maybe even he realized, because before he became king, he was the Duke of York, and he was, as Harry would say, the spare. But during all those years as the spare, he actually created a very meaningful role for himself. He became an advocate for laborers. He visited mines and factories, as he said, without any of that damn red carpet. And he became a real leader in getting better working conditions and putting business leaders together with labor leaders. So he had feel for the common man that helped him later on when he became king, because he could talk to anybody, and he had no snobbery about it. And he could also get along with people all across the political spectrum. In a way, he was better prepared to be monarch. He'd also spent a lot of time around his father, more than even Edward had, and had sort of watched him at work. So, it wasn't a completely, it wasn't a mysterious thing that they walked into, and they knew what they needed to do. I thought one of the most interesting things that I uncovered was that their first public engagement, which was in February 1937, was to go to a place in one of the poorest areas of London, in East London, and visit a place called the People's Palace. And it was a very deliberate attempt on their part to make a connection between Buckingham Palace and the People's Palace. And the Times of London wrote something. They understood exactly what it signified. And they said, what we're witnessing here is somebody who not only gave support for laborers, miners, factory workers, but actually showed leadership. And so I think those qualities were recognized fairly soon after he became king and she became queen consort.
So how was the adjustment for Elizabeth then to this role that she wasn't expecting to have?
I think she moved into it seamlessly. She was, in many ways, she was a lot more media savvy than people give her credit for, which is something we saw more of during the war. But she, she adapted, and she was very comfortable going out in crowds and meeting people and carrying out her duties with charities. And so, as she said, I'm not afraid. I know what I need to do. And she had a real sense of duty and service. And so she just kind of slipped into the royal family. She was not unfamiliar with the royal family. They had been sort of royal family adjacent as a big aristocratic family in Scotland. And so it was not something that threw her in any way.
So what is the state of the monarchy at this time, having just gone through this experience?
Well, I think they really needed, a lot, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people weren't aware of how bad a monarch Edward VIII was. He was irresponsible. He often didn't attend to his government papers. He was negligent, often would not show up for meetings. The Foreign Office was so mistrustful of him that they withheld documents from him. So the monarchy needed to be repaired and rebuilt. And as word slipped out about how irresponsible he had been, Bertie and Elizabeth really needed to demonstrate their decency and their diligence, and to show that the monarchy was strong and that they were capable of carrying out all their duties.
And what is the state of Britain at this time?
Well, we're talking 1936. The world had been through a major depression. And more worrying, you had Hitler on the rise in Germany. You had Mussolini on the rise in Italy. And even more concerning was that Hitler was very rapidly rearming, getting ready for bombings and invasions. So there was a terrible specter on the horizon, which was his ambition to take over Europe and also the United Kingdom. Everybody in Britain, to one degree or another, was, they'd been through the horrors of the First World War, and nobody wanted to get into a second war, which is one reason why appeasement was deployed in those years, from 1937, 1938. But that was not going to work. Everybody knew that war was looming. And so, you had that. At the same time, Bertie and Elizabeth really they rose to the occasion, and they became very effective diplomats. They went to France in the summer of 1938 in an effort to shore up the Anglo-French alliance and to show the effort. The aim was to show Hitler that, he better think twice because they were formidable. Everybody thought that the French army was almost invincible. And so that was the message. There was a moment at the end of that visit to Paris when they went to unveil a monument to Australia and the Australian soldiers who had fought in World War I. And Elizabeth's mother had died right before they went to Paris. And so she had to completely change her wardrobe from black to white mourning. And at this memorial, she was wearing a white dress. And George VI went to the memorial and put down a bouquet of poppies. And this is why I said she was so good at PR. A little boy came over to her and gave her a red poppy. And she took it and she whispered to her husband, and he nodded his head. And she walked up all by herself and put this red poppy on the memorial. It was a very effective and affecting gesture. And it was said that Hitler was watching a newsreel of all this. And he said, that's the most dangerous woman in Europe. He saw her power. And then, of course, the following year, in 1939, they went to Canada and the United States. It was not a particularly safe time to travel, May, June of 1939, when the guns of war were beginning to get loud. And it was again display of their diplomatic skills. And when they only went to the United States for a couple of days, 4 days, I think. And their visit had a real outsized impact because they spent time with Roosevelt in Washington, and they attracted the largest crowds that had ever been seen in Washington. Hundreds of thousands of people lined up to see their carriage procession from Union Station to the White House. And what was more significant was that Roosevelt and George VI spent a lot of time together, both in the White House and when the royal couple traveled to Hyde Park in New York. And it was in those meetings that George VI and FDR mapped out the ways in which America could help Britain short of war. And they developed the plans for what became the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, which was vital for Britain in the early years of the war, and then what became the Lend-Lease program. It's sort of created and solidified this special relationship, which Churchill then deepened when he was spending a lot of time with Roosevelt. So it was a really, really important trip. And one of the things that really impressed Roosevelt was that both the king and the queen were so well informed about America, and that everywhere they went, they asked very specific and pertinent questions. And I think that really impressed him. But on a personal level, they got along very well. Roosevelt had a sort of avuncular view of both of them. And then, of course, they had the famous lunch in Hyde Park, where they were served hot dogs for the first time. And Elizabeth didn't know quite what to do about how to eat them. And she just daintily cut them up with a knife and fork and ate them that way. George VI ate them the proper way.
Amazing story. So then when the war breaks out, does their role look the same, or what does their role look like during that time period?
Well, one of the things that was wonderful about the time that I spent in the Royal Archives is that I was able to read his diary that he kept from the first day of World War II, which was September 3rd, 1939. And I could really see his evolution as a leader, and how hard he worked to understand all the military strategy. And also, he met with everybody. And it was striking to see how many people relied on his sort of good sense, his good judgment, and used him as a sounding board. Some of them came to him crying about things that had happened or mistakes that they'd made. But he had he knew what he had to do. He knew he had to be conversant with everything. And this was what I was really surprised by, that they really did have a partnership. She said later on, he told me everything. And everything included everything about the Enigma codes, everything about the atomic bomb. And the king hosted lunches in Buckingham Palace, weekly lunches for the most part, for Churchill. And she participated in many of them. And Churchill really, really, he trusted her. He trusted her discretion. But so there was an early part of the war they called the Phony War. And during those months, it was about 8 months, the king and queen went to a lot of factories and, shipyards, places where Britain was gearing up to fight because the big fight hadn't happened. And then when the Blitz began in late August 1940, their role shifted. And it became very important for them to travel around the country and really witness the devastation and witness the suffering that people were going through. And it was the scenes in London, and they returned again and again to the poorest neighborhoods of London. And the people would sing to them, and they were right in the middle. You think members of the royal family are sort of distant from the people. They were right, sort of right in the middle of crowds and in very sort of physical situations. And they developed a real bond with the people, and the people could see that they were there for them right at the beginning of the Blitz. The Home Office in the British government said, you cannot live in Buckingham Palace. It's too dangerous. So in September of 1940, they moved to Windsor, but they came into London almost every day and worked there. There were 9 bombings of Buckingham Palace, and the King and Queen were on the premises for 3 of them. The second one, on the 13th of September, 1940, was a direct hit, and they didn't have time to get to the bomb shelter, and they came very, very close to being killed. Although people didn't know that until after the war, but it was an exceedingly close call. As Churchill wrote after the war, he said if the windows where they were standing had been closed instead of open, they would have been lacerated. The flying glass would have, I don't know if it would have killed them, but it would have maimed them in a significant way. But they persevered. And I think George VI traveled 50,000 miles through the war, visiting places like Coventry and all the places that had been bombed. And after that very close call, he issued a statement saying, we have now personally experienced German barbarity, and it has increased our resolve to fight to the end and achieve victory. And that was the sort of inspiration that they gave to the people. And the people knew that what they were going through is also what the King and Queen were going through. There's another quote, a famous quote, after they were bombed, where she said, well, now I can look the East End in the face, and they know what we have endured is the same as what the people in the really distressed neighborhoods were undergoing. And they went out a lot in the middle of bombing raids, and they would be hustled into the basements of police stations, and they would have a cup of strong tea and a couple of cookies. And when the all clear came, they would leave. But people knew this. They knew that they were putting their lives at risk. And I think that forged a bond and engendered a level of respect, if not, admiration and inspiration. That's really strengthened not only their position, but the position of the monarchy in general.
Wow, that is profound. So the war ends. What does life look like for them afterwards?
Well, England was pretty bleak after the war. There were still the restrictions on necessities were still very tough. So, and they had to deal with a completely new government. Churchill was thrown out in July 1945, even before the final end of the war, and replaced by an overwhelming majority of the Labour government. Now, the Labour government, both Elizabeth and George VI, although they had to remain apolitical, their sympathies were certainly more with the Conservative Party and their policies than they were with Labour. And Labour did some pretty radical things. They nationalized a number of industries, and they carried out social and economic policies that the King and Queen didn't really agree with personally, but they knew that it was their role to get along. And they knew all the Labour leaders because many of them had served in the wartime cabinet. And so George VI, after having had such a close relationship with Churchill, had to make a pretty swift pivot and get along with Attlee, who was an admirable man but he was not easy to get along with. He was very reticent. And George VI found that frustrating and even called him behind his back the clam because he just never said much of anything. But Attlee, to his credit, recognized George VI's value. He said he had a very strong judgment and was very reliable. And so he admired and respected the king. And the king, in turn, admired and respected him, even though they disagreed on probably most of every single policy that Labor was enacting. But it was a dark period. And the other part of it, of course, was personal. On the one hand, the war was over, the bombs weren't falling. They weren't having red warnings in Windsor Castle anymore. They were able to go out and stay in the house that is now occupied by Prince Andrew, but it was their house, Royal Lodge. And they loved going there because, as he wrote in his diary, they could be away from their servants and they could have some privacy. And he called the family "we four." They were very tight, those four. And so this was a nice opportunity for them to spend some relatively placid time after the turbulence of the 6 years of World War II. But also, he was sick. The war took a terrible toll on him. He, for 40 years, had been smoking almost 2 packs of cigarettes a day, partly because he was afraid of public speaking. And I think it calmed him down. But it did terrible damage to him. And he also felt the strain of speaking. He never got rid of that. He became better at it. He learned how to master the way he expressed himself. But it was always a strain. And so, starting in 1948, his health began to decline. First from arteriosclerosis, for which he had 1 procedure, but the threat of having a blood clot was very real. And then, of course, in 1951, he was diagnosed with lung cancer and had his left lung removed. So it was supposed to be a sort of peaceful period after all that turbulence. And it turned out to be a time of great worry.
So the title of your book is about saving the monarchy. How did they?
Well, really, they did it right off the bat by showing through the quality of their character that they could be a king and queen and effectively represent the nation and connect with the people and carry out their duties. And each time they were tested, they rose to the occasion. So, they saved it almost from the get-go. And then they became very inspirational leaders during the Second World War. And there were a lot of people who wondered how in the world Britain would have fared if Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson had been king and queen, particularly since they were Nazi sympathizers. But so by taking over from him in particular, and by showing their qualities, they were able to restore the faith and the ability of the monarchy to lead the nation.
So as you look back, what are the lessons you take away from their life as a couple, as individuals?
Well, the lessons, I think, are that it's no trivial thing to be devoted to duty and service. And you see that commitment, and you certainly saw it in Queen Elizabeth II You see it in Charles III. And they recognized the importance of the monarchy as a great unifying force that at the same time has to sort of transcend politics. There was a wonderful phrase that I've often cited, which I think is quite beautiful, that the monarchy is the light above politics. And they recognize that. They were also, it's very important that they were an admirable domestic partnership with an admirable family, at least in those days. And in being that, they set an example. And they knew how to reward people for doing the same, for sacrificing and for carrying out duties and performing service. And so I think they solidified the role, defined the role in their own way, and set an example for their daughter in particular. I mean, I was so struck that they began training her at such an early age. George V, he saw the deficiencies in his eldest son, Edward VIII, and he knew even when Princess Elizabeth, was a very little girl, that she was going to be queen one day. He just knew it. And as a consequence, she was out and doing public engagements as early as 4 years old. And there was a moment that really struck me. And that was when they were only months away from the outbreak of the Second World War. And the Prime Minister of Poland was in London working out a treaty, an arrangement for Britain to come to Poland's aid if Hitler invaded. And they had a lunch at Buckingham Palace, and there were a dozen adults sitting at that table, and one 12-year-old heiress presumptive. There she was at age 12 with all these big men, they were all men, and listening to this, pretty high-level conversation. So they were getting her ready and setting an example. And they had her out during the war along with them, particularly when it became a little safer and the bombing was less. And she played a very important role going out and visiting the troops before D-Day. So that was a very important part of their mission because they knew that she was their legacy and they knew that she had to be properly trained. I mean, they arranged for her to take a course at Eton College down the road from Windsor in the Constitution and history. She even studied American history. And when Joseph Kennedy was ambassador to Britain and came to lunch at Windsor Castle, he was seated next to Princess Elizabeth, and she sort of stunned and amazed him with her knowledge of American geography. So she was very clued in on a lot of matters.
Thank you for sharing those lessons. And Elizabeth, a conversation about her sounds like it would be incredible as well.
Yes, well, we could.
That would be amazing. Is there anything that you think we should have discussed but didn't in this conversation?
Well, we could have talked about the treachery of King Edward VIII and how duplicitous he was with his brother, in addition to everything he did with Wallace Simpson, and how in fairly significant ways he lied about his money and a lot of other things, and behaved very badly. It was appalling, really, that in the fall of 1937, anybody who was clued in Britain knew exactly what Hitler was doing, that the former king and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent 2 weeks in Germany, meeting with Hitler and his high command. And although nobody would bow or curtsy to Wallace in Britain, everybody she met in Germany bowed and curtsied to her. And the people put out the straight arm salute and said, "Heil Edward." And he in return said, "Heil Hitler." So it was a pretty shameful thing that they did. And it was no surprise that in 1940, when the war was really raging, Winston Churchill and George VI decided that they'd better get him as far away as possible. And they sent him to the Bahamas to be the governor general, where he was for the entire war, because they didn't trust him, with good reason.
Thankfully, George VI and Elizabeth became the monarch.
Yes, we should all be thankful. Some people have said there should be a statue in London to Wallace Simpson, because who knows what happened if she hadn't come along.
Sally, this has been profound and delightful. Thank you so much for bringing this book to the public, sharing the knowledge. It's been wonderful. So appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Very good conversation. I much enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to Historical Snapshots on Substack, or like and follow wherever you listen to the podcast.